It's so lovely to see so many people here for a session with Dr. Jaye Johnson Thiel from the University of Alabama. To start our session today, I just wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land. You know that the home of the centre is at QUT. So we have the QUT acknowledgement on the screen there. I also wanted to acknowledge that many of us today are coming from Dharawal country, which is where UOW is, the University of Wollongong in New South Wales. We're a large stretch of country which goes from Botany Bay in the south of Sydney down to Nowra in the Shoalhaven area. And UOW has a really special home in Dharawal country. We're situated at the base of Mount Kembla, which is a female mountain, and known as the knowledge holder in the Dharawal country. So it's a special place for us to be a university institution at the base of that mountain. So I'd like to pay my respects to Aboriginal people that may be with us today, and to certainly the custodians of our land and our elders, past, present, and future. A couple of housekeeping things just before we start our session today. The seminar is recorded, so your image and voice will be captured. Please feel free to turn off your camera if you don't want your image captured. And we just ask that everybody mute their microphone just for ease of recording. During the presentation, if you could turn off your camera, that would help us with the bandwidth to make sure that, that things run smoothly. Jaye is going to talk with us for about 30 minutes. We'll see how we go, and there'll be opportunity for us to ask questions and to engage in conversation with Jaye at the conclusion. I'd like to acknowledge my good friend and colleague, Professor Annette Woods, who's co-chairing this seminar with me today. If you have questions throughout the session, please pop those into the chat facility within Zoom. Annette and I will be monitoring those, and we'll make sure that they're connected to at the end of the session. And feel free to tweet about the session, and you can see the hashtags that we're using just there. Now, it's an enormous privilege for me to be able to introduce Dr. Jaye Johnson Thiel to all of you, although I suspect that she's known to many of you already. So Jaye is coming to us from the University of Alabama, where she is a professor of early childhood studies. Many of you know the quality and the caliber and the depth of Jaye's work. And I think what's so important about Jaye is that she came to academe with a strong experience as a teacher, particularly in those early childhood years. And I think that richness is something that she brings to her work. I think Jaye is a very generous scholar, and you just have to read her work around her own muchness and what it is that she brings to academe to understand the richness of her story and her experiences and how she brings that into her work. Jaye pushes against discourses, particularly deficit discourses with young people, and really tries hard to think about play-based practices for community research, and explores that notion of embodied literacies, hence her invitation to speak with us today. Jaye certainly rethinks how educators, families and communities work together to develop practices and policies. And what Jaye can do with a box of fabric is something that everybody needs to see. Jaye has co-edited a book with Candice Kuby and Karen Spector. We'll put that reference into the chat site. If you haven't seen that, I encourage you to have a look at it. How anybody can get a monster into a book chapter is a sight to be seen. On that note, I think it's probably the best thing to pass over to Jaye so that she can share her expertise with us. So welcome, Jaye. I'm going to stop sharing so that you can share with us.
I'm going to bring up this PowerPoint really quickly, and then here. Right. Well, first I want to say thank you to everyone in the Digital Child team there for inviting me to give this seminar today. And I'm really excited to share some of the thinking that I've been doing. And to help me stay on time, I have a little script or a narrative that I prepared to go along with my PowerPoint. I have learned over time that the social construct of time can cause me some tensions if I just wing it when there is a time constraint. So I am going to work at using the reading as I go to keep me on track. So, seeing the pandemic as an actant that reconfigured the world-making practices of living, playing, resting, dying, and so on, I wanted to take this as an opportunity to consider the ways a world embodies and absorbs a pandemic, particularly through children's play lives. So what you will hear today are just some of the things I've been grappling with over the course of the pandemic as I consider how digital or virtual spaces have been constructing childhood over the past 2 years. In my title, I use the terms glitches, bugs, and viruses metaphorically, as all of them are similar, but used discursively in both digital and natural contexts. In simplified terms, glitches refers to a fault or malfunction that occurs in a digital circuit. One might read the arrival of COVID-19 as a glitch, something that disrupted our everyday lives, our daily rhythms. Similarly, a bug is an error, flaw, or fault in a computer program that produces unexpected results and/or behaves in unintended ways. COVID has certainly produced unexpected realities in our lives, and many of the institutional and political responses to COVID have resulted in unintentional consequences to world-making practices that are unfolding even as I give this seminar. Viruses, in computer lingo, modify code to change outcomes. Being that COVID is a virus, I think that's an obvious similarity. COVID not only modifies human bodies, though, it also modifies the very way our bodies and the bodies around us, human and more than human alike, move, think, feel, engage, etc. So today I'd like to share this narrative of my grapplings with the many ways child has been constructed in online spaces since the pandemic started, particularly during a semi-global lockdown. The ideas and wonderings I share are meant to provide a space for discussion, and at the end, we can all engage in thinking together as a collective. First, I want to hold some space for the pain and loss this pandemic has produced. To discuss play and to not also discuss the pain and things that have surrounded this pandemic, I think is short-sighted. So I do want to hold that space for just maybe 10 seconds. Okay, and the second thing is I want to introduce you to Luna, who is my dog. And since it is 7 p.m. here, I am at home, which means Luna shares the space with me. And she's usually a fairly quiet dog, but sometimes she needs my help because she does not have thumbs. Therefore, she cannot open the back door herself. So hopefully she will not need that. But if something happens, I might have to step just to keep her from being too interruptive during our time together. So I want to let you know that ahead of time. All right. In February of this year, I started to see new reports online of families and organizations calling for a summer of play. This plea was in direct response to educational policymakers' decisions to claim summer as a time for young people to, quote, catch up on what seemingly was lost during the pandemic. To consider how we got here, we have to go back to early 2020, March to be exact. On March 9th, 2020, our university and several surrounding school districts went on spring break. By Friday of the same week, March 13th, 2020, we were notified that we were not to physically return to our institutional buildings, but rather teaching and learning would shift to a digital, yet still very institutional landscape. March 2nd, 2020 is the last time that I personally have taught in a university classroom rather than a digital one. New digital literacies became necessary quickly and without warning. As professors, we were asked to suspend all required synchronous activity and redesign the rest of the semester. In fairness, we were given a 2-week cushion to, quote, figure it out. K-12 teachers in the surrounding area weren't so lucky, as they were asked to transition from a physical classroom to a virtual one over a weekend, and some were asked to, quote, figure it out overnight. Caregivers in birth through 5-year early learning spaces were given a unique challenge of figuring it out. They had to figure out how to teach online, how to teach in person, how to make child centers COVID safe, and equally important, how to keep the lights on and the doors open when these centers lost over half of the young people they served overnight, and with it, a loss of revenue that helped keep buildings open. In a matter of days, homes, work, schools, recreation melded together, recreating new geographies, including those of childhood. What once was conceptualized as separate, compartmentalized, now pushed up against and overlapped, making it harder than ever to ignore what Doreen Massey would call the thrown togetherness of being, a coalescence of people, places, and things in a particular moment. When one has a seismic shift in the landscape, there are big changes all at once. And as a researcher who concerns herself with the conceptions of childhood, I was particularly interested in the movements of childhood geographies during a pandemic. As a result, I found it necessary to begin considering the ways concepts were being reconfigured, particularly the concept of play, and therefore childhood itself. Given that our ability to physically be in our researchers' spaces was suspended, I turned my attention to the digital virtual world for answers. This led me to my first wondering: how is play as a concept being reconfigured through its relationship with COVID-19? Not too long after our geographical boundaries shifted, news headlines started rumbling of the new crisis, a crisis that focused on the play lives of young people. I provided a samplings of those headlines here. Some reassured families with benefits and positive outcomes. Some spoke of loss and deprivation. Some equated play with business and seriousness, while others reported on inaccessibility of play in physical space. It is a fact that childhood geographies were different, and as a result, play might be different too. After seeing these headlines and headlines like these, I became quite fascinated with this idea. And for months, I spent hours each day searching different configurations of hashtags containing the words COVID, play, pandemic, lockdown, and childhood. What I found was what I sort of expected. Children were still playing. As Malcolm explains in the movie Jurassic Park, life finds a way. What I want to share with you now are a few of the socio-material shifts I found documented by families and caregivers online. I am not a Facebook, or what is at this afternoon is now called Meta, or a Twitter user, and that I don't have an active account, and therefore everything I found was open to the public for viewing through a simple search. The play I found wasn't all that different, and then it still involved animals, artwork, superheroes, and much, much more. One notable difference I did see was that children were, of course, infusing COVID into their imaginative play. Although at its core, children infusing the social, political, cultural, and economic into their play lives has always been there, because children are always already a part of all of those things. Superheroes now needed masks. Family members were undergoing temperature checks with toy thermometers. My own niece was setting up COVID hospitals for her stuffed animals. Even rough and tumble play was punctuated with pandemic narratives, as illustrated in this video of two toddlers playing quarantine, a video you may have seen, but is worth watching nonetheless. So I'm going to play this real quick. Okay. So news reports started sharing play stories to let the older folks know that the younger folks were doing exactly what younger folks do, learning how the world works with the world. Take, for example, this excerpt from The Atlantic. It reads, during a recent game of doctor, John Miles' daughter was examining her younger sister. The 4-year-old measured her sister's temperature with a fake thermometer, listened to her heart and breath with a toy stethoscope, and tested her reflexes with gentle taps from a small plastic hammer. After the examination, she diagnosed her patient with a coronavirus and declared in a matter-of-fact tone that her sister would probably die. Just as older folks adjusted to life with COVID in their own ways, baking, Netflix docuseries, TikTok videos, young people adjusted in their ways too. These virtual stories seem to suggest that play as a verb wasn't lost or missing or deprived or even too different. It was alive and well and still being used as a mechanism to make sense of and with alongside the world itself. While COVID certainly entered into playfulness, children didn't stop playing. They just continued remixing and infusing their lives into their play as they have always done. So here are a few more examples of how children were playing and being constructed through digital space. Here we have a child who was swimming in the bathtub as play in her bathing suit, and they did a whole like we were at the swimming pool kind of thing. Down here, this person had access to outdoor space and had their children doing some things on the in nature. It's outside to play. These across from each other kind of feel a little bit like the movie Inception, where there's like, oh, we're looking at digital space, but they're in digital space as well. So you're seeing toddlers who are engaging in listening to their teachers read over internet and doing like finger play through that. And then this is play dates with toddlers in a Zoom class. This is a slide of a child who decided to try to solve COVID and created this plan to make something to scare the virus, to make the scary thing get bigger and then scare the virus, and then make a virus that can't hurt the virus, that can hurt the virus but not hurt humans. And then there are certainly pictures like this of playgrounds that have been caution taped off and that you couldn't go and play on these playgrounds, and people wondering if children would remember this. So this leads me to my second wondering. As adults, we seem to have this obsession with the idea that things only happen in the spaces we have created for them to happen in, such as play only happening on playgrounds or in schools or in sports fields, etc. But if we pay attention, young people teach us otherwise. just as they are teaching me through the photos their caregivers post about their play lives. Although adults seem to cling onto this idea that, quote, normal play is grounded in a very particular place or space, those places are often created by adults with adult configurations of the world in mind. Adult worlds were so shook by the stay-at-home mandates and the mandates of a world in a pandemic that often these playful moments they were posting online were seen as reasons why children needed to play, rather than realizing their children were playing. And so I want you to consider, are we actually listening to the ways young people produce play? And how are our ideas of what play looks like produced by bigger social, cultural, political, and economic constructs? Contemplating this question, I can attest that in the United States, many children are not given the time nor the space for uninterrupted free play at school or home, really, for that matter. And when they are given time to play on a school playground, it is often 15 minutes or less and used as an incentive to get children to work longer, harder, and faster. I have witnessed time and again children being forced to forego recess because they didn't complete something or were performing in ways that were deemed as off task or troublesome. And I suppose in the eyes of a capitalist society, one might read these behaviors as such. When play is allowed inside the classroom, that play is most often teacher-led and sold in boxed curriculums so that teachers can justify their existence. Of course, with that being said, children still find ways to play in unsanctioned ways all the time. Children in the US who are most often affected by these policies are those who live in wage-poor communities and or identify as people of color, Black, Latino, Asian, etc. Public schooling in the United States as a practice often embodies a literacy of neoliberalism, and children are being produced as part of that neoliberal agenda and are therefore often seen as commodities. As the two tweets show you here, that equate early child care to quality job performance and early care as a way to generate economic activity. For those of you who may not be familiar with neoliberalism, neoliberalism is an ideology that sees competition as the defining characteristic of human relations. It defines citizens as consumers whose democratic choices are best exercised by buying and selling, a process that rewards merit and punishes inefficiency in order to curb the power of labor. Neoliberalism has created massive tax cuts for the rich in the United States, as in Jeff Bezos kind of tax cuts, not persons who live in the big houses on the street kind of thing. Crushes trade unions, it's deregulated things, privatized many things, that's works through outsourcing, and it really sees public services as a space that needs to be in competition with each other. In schools, this neoliberal ideology is translated to standardization, quote, high quality curriculums, high stakes testing, accountability, returns on investment, and college and career readiness. As Lindgren posits, the configuration of the child as a certain kind of being in and across discourses and practices affects not only the educational practices and the physical realities children are in, but also how children perceive and make themselves known as children in child bodies. Karen Murris has offered us a lovely example of this in her video, A Manifesto of the Posthuman Child. In this video, she illustrates how certain philosophical concepts of the child and childhood have unintended and maybe in some cases intended consequences for how children are perceived and in turn make themselves known, as you can see here. Different philosophical viewpoints have framed children as innocent, fragile, egocentric. I would also like to make a note here about Margaret Donaldson, who actually studied under Piaget and said he was wrong about egocentrism in childhood. But given the practices of academia, I find that few have heard of her. Through my work and thinking, I believe an additional conception of childhood has materialized: the neoliberal child. Born of capitalism and Keynesian economic theory, the neoliberal child is seen as a commodity, but one that lacks economic production and is therefore in need of certain 21st century skills, career and college readiness, or job training. In the United States, children as young as 4 and 5 are to meet goals that will in turn make them, quote, workforce ready, end quote, when the time comes. It has become increasingly apparent that neoliberalism informs educational practice and therefore can be seen as a material discursive apparatus of production, or an instrument of power through which particular meanings and bodies and material discursive boundaries are produced. In other words, I believe that neoliberalism has become an embodied literacy, or a material discursive practices our bodies come to know and engage in, often without questioning, that make and unmake realities. And this leads me back to the summer of play conundrum that has unfolded in the many virtual spaces I have encountered as I explored play during the time of the pandemic lockdown. As 2020 and the 15 days to slow the spread bled into 2021, and folks started growing weary and going back to work and school, and the ways of knowing the world during a pandemic started to settle into our bodies, I noticed another shift in the way play was being configured in the digital world. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, families continued to worry about a deprivation of play, and therefore wanted children to have what they considered were meaningful play experiences during the summer, calling for a summer of play. While schools started to worry that children had been given too much playtime, they were calling for a summer of catch-up. And so there is this tug of war happening between families and policymakers about what summer should look like for children. This phenomenon is happening across many countries: the US, the UK, Australia. In fact, the CARES Act in the US that gave schools billions of dollars came with a caveat that districts would have to prove how they were using the funds to catch up students over the summer and in the following year. However, I do seem to see more families on board with the catching up narrative in the US, as I have had many conversations with people who expressed their concerns that children lost something academically, as if we didn't make all of this up to begin with, right? So on a broader scale, families are asking for more play, less academics, and policymakers are asking for academics, less play. And this is all unfolding in digital space for me, and materializing as realities for children and their particular context. But this concern for academics lost isn't a new one, at least in a US context. In the summer of 2016, I started working on a chapter that is in the book I co-edited that Lisa mentioned with Candace Kuby and Karen Spector, titled Posthumanism and Literacy Education. Revisiting my own summer of play in the 1980s, the chapter discusses the idea of summer slide, which is a very common concept used in the United States to justify the need for summer academics well before the pandemic ever hit. As I write in the chapter, according to my research, the first mention of summer slide was in 1906 in an article written by W. White and printed in American Education titled Reviews Before and After Vacation. 1906. Let that sink in. Over a century provided ample time for a deficit perspective about children and working class wage-poor families to gain an ecological stronghold in the material discursive productions of summer activities. A Google search offered pages at the time I wrote the chapter, 8,260 of them, of online resources that referenced White's article. A myriad of educational summer programs and research reports seem to all champion traditional summer academics as a strategy to keep summer slide at bay. Each of the 20 links I opened and read made some type of general reference to targeting families experiencing economic inequalities, or families that they called living in poverty, and generally position these families as being less engaged in what they saw as meaningful summer activities. But what worlds do these constructions make for folks who grew up like me? I grew up in a working class, or what would be considered a wage poor family. Who gets to decide what meaningful summer activities even are? As you can see, academic summers have long since been a part of our world-making practices. So this dilemma we are facing right now isn't all that new. It just comes on the heels of a life-altering event, and therefore seems more urgent than maybe it did in years past. Ultimately, there are monies to be had when children are constructed as neoliberal. Things like standardized testing, leveled readers, boxed curriculums, all create massive income for an elite few, and that desire to accumulate wealth doesn't stop during the summer, nor does it stop during a pandemic. Do you remember those teachers I talked about at the beginning? The ones that changed their classrooms overnight in response to a pandemic? Well, in the US, they were thanked by being federally mandated to administer standardized tests this year, despite the fact that they were asked to teach in multiple ways: online, face-to-face, hybrid, and that model often changed from day to day. This doesn't even take into the account the stress and fear and loss those teachers may have experienced in their own personal lives. So while families are asking, can we have a summer of play? In the shadows of neoliberalism, I can't help but think this question might not be doing enough, which leads me to my last wondering. What kind of questions should we ask instead? I'm not trying to work in a binary here, and I'm not trying to say we shouldn't concern ourselves with the ways in which children, and people of all ages for that matter, get to play, and where and how and who gets to play certain things at certain times in certain places. These are all important things to consider. I am simply asking, have we really thought about the fact that both of the ways that adults are conceptualizing play worlds for young people during a pandemic also have the unintended consequences of producing children in deficit ways? One sees childhood as missing out on play, losing something, while the others see childhood as missing out on academics, again, losing something. All the while, as the digital constructions of childhood illustrate here, children have been playing, they've been learning, and in many instances have been a bit more free from the educational constraints, or at least freer of what Nixon calls slow violence that neoliberal schooling produces. I'm not saying that children didn't find themselves missing particular things, like playgrounds and friends and probably their teachers and their schools. But have we considered the embodied literacies we carry with us and pass on to our youngest, especially when these embodiments are steeped in producing for and with hypercapitalism? Perhaps our questions should be focused on why schooling is producing young people as commodities and how. Why institutional spaces haven't been giving young folks the playtime we all deserve. And why do we even have to fight for a summer of play in the first place? As Karen Muris explains, modern schooling positions children as knowledge innocent, consumers, not producers, because it assumes that they are still developing, still innocent, still fragile, still immature, still irrational, and so forth. And I would add that perhaps modern families are unknowingly doing some of these same things. So I'm left wondering, have we asked the young people what they want? What are their desires for summer, for fall, for days and months and years beyond the next one, and for the moments right now in this minute, in this time in their lives? As I get caught up in the worry for young people, it has been helpful for me to listen to the world-making practices children are always already engaged in through these play events. And as I've explored the digital archives of social media, it was clear that while play did change during lockdown, it also adapted despite the restrictions, and it endured through a global pandemic. It seemed clear to me that no matter where play happens, home, school, sports fields, playgrounds, during a rainstorm, a sunny day, or during a pandemic, children have much to teach us by the ways they engage in world making and by how the world influences the way they engage. As I come to the close of my narrative, I realized that in my abstract for this seminar, I promised to make suggestions and offer strategies for play practices in formal and informal spaces of learning, and offer insights for policies and initiatives focused on the well-being of young children. But I'm also aware these suggestions are coming from an adult who has used adult understandings of the world to try and make sense of snippets of play stories posted online by adults on adult social media platforms about children. And I would assume that is kind of the problem, huh? So rather than leave you with a quote to-do list, my simple but not always so easy to accomplish list of strategies include the following. Listen to children. Sounds easy, but to do what Bronwyn Davies or Peter Moss ask us is a bit harder, because we often already have a response in mind when children start to talk, and I would argue that that isn't really listening. Provide space, time, and access to materials. Let them figure out what things do without telling them what they do. We often hand children things and say, this is a cup and it's used for drinking out of, rather than just letting them explore what a cup might be able to do, say, interact with it. Let them explore, create, and be. We don't need to see what our children are doing all the time, nor do we need to entertain them all the time. I know that we have somehow got ourselves in the space where we feel like we have to do that, but it's actually good for children to have the space that where adults aren't always watching and to have their own private spaces. This one might make you laugh, but watch Bluey. I know this is an Australian show, and it is also playing in the US, and it's on Disney Plus. And I will say that I feel like it offers so many wonderful ideas about what it means to be with children, whether you think about the teacher Calypso, or the parents, or just the two of them playing Bluey and Bluey's sister. Ask children what they want and have critical discussions about what that means. It's okay to say, hey, if we do that, what do you think will happen? And express your own fears around that. But children should be able to discuss why they want to do something and make a case for that. Ask yourself, why am I inclined to say no? Because often the answer to that question has nothing to do with what children want and need, and more to do about adult stuff. I had a student who was telling me a story. I had talked to her about feminist new materialisms and actants, particularly around materials. And she said that she had lived just year after year with her 4-year-olds when they'd gone on the playgrounds, feeling like she was fighting them about a stick. They wanted to use the stick. They wanted to play with the sticks. And she'd say, no, you can't use a stick. Put down the stick. You can't use a stick. And she said, after she read that and had the conversation with me, she went outside and the kids were picking up the sticks, of course. And she said, she almost said something. She was like, no, this time I'm just going to let it happen. And she realized that in letting that happen, it opened up a world of possibilities that could have never happened before, that was much richer than when she had said no. I also think we have to get comfortable with the idea that children will find ways to play, sanctioned or not, regardless of the conditions that we set forth for them, because they are also humans in the world and need to be seen as in ways that they're capable and competent and able to make theories about the world in which we live in. And my last suggestion to you is to let your body remember. So sometime this week, or maybe next week, or over the weekend, build a fort, get in it, and do whatever you want to while you're inside. Because sometimes our bodies need a moment to remember what we have forgotten. So while I won't say I'm glad that we all have had to experience a global pandemic and its disruptions, I have found the virus, along with its glitches and bugs, as an opportunity for me to rethink, reimagine, and remember play and the conditions of possibility surrounding its proliferation. Now I'm going to open it up to discussion and questions. I just want to know, what are you grappling with?
Thank you so much, Jay. That was just so many ideas within just a very short period of time. And I want to say thank you very much for sharing that with us. And I'm sure that I'm speaking for all others. These Zoom formats are just so strange in terms of not being able to actually represent how thankful we are for people's ideas. So I know people are clapping as well, but that kind of almost seems just a little not quite enough either. So I'll represent everybody and say thank you very much for that. So we are going to move to the audience questions very shortly, but I had just one thing that I was wondering whether you might kind of puzzle with me a little bit more, just to kind of ease us into that, if that's okay. So one of the things that Michael Deswani, myself and Lisa have been, and others have been questioning and querying, and one of the reasons why we thought we would bring some of our friends and colleagues to these seminars to, you know, start to think about the ideas, was the notion around there being some really specific challenges with how we might think about materiality in digital contexts. So I'm just wondering if you can talk just a little bit about the conceptualization of digital materiality, particularly since or in regards to your understandings around uninterrupted play and representations of children in hypercapitalism, because it certainly puts some layers over the top of thinking about materiality in digital worlds, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And digital play worlds.
Yeah. Well, and I think those are, you know, they're different things, right? In the sense of like a digital play world versus like this world, a digital world that constructs children's play in very particular ways, right? And certainly that's what some of the things I was looking at was like when we put these things out in the world, and especially when we put them out in these like 140 characters or something, I'm not exactly sure, but it's pretty short. I think it's kind of like a double-edged thing. It's one thing that it gets us thinking and talking about things, but then it also can produce what I would consider a very real material thing for children, right? So all these discussions are happening around and about children, and I don't know how much of the time children themselves are being asked a certain thing, right? Like how they feel about it. And with that being said, I think the digital world, as ephemeral as it can feel at times, very much produces the realities that we live in. And I mean, just to go beyond that, when I think about I'll say this is particular to US context, but our political climate right now is very much predicated on what people have read and see, just even COVID related, like people reading things that say that getting a vaccination or wearing a mask is bad because of all of this, right? And it produces this very realities where we're faced with lots and lots of half of our population not getting a vaccine because of that, right? So I do think this online space creates a material reality, even though it can feel very ephemeral and kind of like something's there that you can't physically touch, right? And I do think it within that perpetuates some of the neoliberal agendas that I was talking about, like the tweets that I showed you from the pre-K classroom. And that has been something, those tweets were back early 2000, maybe 17, I think. And like every year, those same kind of tweets and discourse during Georgia pre-K week come up, right? So there's this understanding now within this space of people who are looking at it, that that's what we should be doing in early childhood, is thinking about how these bodies can become economic subjects in our society.
Sure.
So,
and I think also, you know, another layer on top of that, of course, is that in some ways the material world seems to produce us in ways that are slightly more homogenous. And so some of that unevenness, whether that be related to power or equality, inclusion, starts to almost, you know, be backgrounded and less transparent, perhaps. So I'm going to move, because I want to make sure that we do have some time. Thank you very much for that, Jaye. I'm going to move to some questions that others have here. Please feel free to put your camera and obviously your mics on when I call upon you. If you would rather not do that and would like me to read a question that you've put into the chat, that's fine. Please just indicate that as well. I'll start with Catherine. Welcome.
Oh, hi, thanks, Janet. Sorry, I actually put a question in there, but I want to comment on just something that Jaye said, because I think it's something that I've been grappling with around the tweets that really position around the value and the predictive role of early childhood education and care. And I think it's a challenge, because I think there is a place for that messaging, because what it does is it highlights the significance of the rich educational experiences and the importance of those in those first 5 years. But I think we need to be careful about then suggesting that that dictates what that looks like. And I think they're two very different narratives around the value of the first 5 years. And so I guess part of my question then, and it links in to that, one of the things that you talked about was this catch-up climate, which I think there's a real danger that we're catching up. And Lisa spoke to that idea that, you know, they're behind what? And so I'm wondering, we talk about the losses of COVID, but I also reflect on the gifts of COVID and what COVID has allowed us to do to pause and reflect. And I'm wondering how we can tap into this experience to reposition the role of play in children's lives. And more importantly, what does that look like? And that moment of the value that it places for children where they're at, and not necessarily where they need to be. And Faye and I were talking through your talk about the playgrounds. And in Australia, there was huge pushback in Victoria when they wanted to restrict access to playgrounds. And we talked about some of that was more than just for children. It was the social affordances that playgrounds provide, not just for children's connections, but for familial connections and the importance of that. So there's a few comments there that I've thrown back at you, only because your talk was so enriching and just raised so many questions for me. So I'll throw that back to you, Jaye.
Yeah, I wish I had answers for how we enter into, like, how do we use this as a moment, right, for momentum, to really think about, like, how are we positioning play in schools, and how do we then reconfigure what that looks like and what we accept as play. And at the moment, I don't have any great answers. I will say that my next step to this is that I have this plan and a little bit of money to go into some classrooms and kind of think about how play is shifting in relation to COVID, which will be interesting to see kind of like how, because there are certain things that are like in place that weren't in place before, right? Like mask wearing and like making, like what I like to call making space for others rather than 6 feet apart, and that sort of thing. So it'll be interesting to see like where there might be little openings in that. What I also wonder is like, how can we use some of these digital platforms to possibly put our own constructions out there. So I'm with you. I agree that I want to see the importance of early childhood being put out in the world, right? And letting people realize how important that actually is, and what the affordances of those kind of spaces can offer. And I think that it really comes down to maybe our jobs to start kind of doing it. I don't tweet, so then there's like that issue, right? Like I don't do that. I'm not in that.
On that, Jaye.
So it's like one of those things where it's also difficult because I want to engage, but then I'm like, I have to sign up to actually respond to any of this. So I don't want to do that. So yeah, I think it's a tricky space and I don't have answers. And it's actually something I would love to go deeper into, is like, where then now, how do we use this as momentum? How do we not let ourselves get to where we're even further into this idea that only academics, like in these particular ways, matter. Because I'd argue we're all playing. It all looks different, right?
Yeah, for sure, I think. Natalie has a wonderful question that I think will really follow nicely on from your comments there around unstructured time and agency. So Natalie.
Hi. Thanks so much for that, Jay. That was so interesting. And yeah, my question is around children's agency and really looking at play as a benefit in its own right, and how great free play can be, and just what that looks like in a digital space. You know, thinking about how children use the products. So they are adult designed, adult distributed. If adults are the ones designing all these platforms and programs, does that impact how a child uses it? And so it's just a question I had around celebrating children's agency on a digital space, whether that's in the classroom and at home with parent-child play too.
Yeah, I mean, certainly one of the things I think became very apparent is how powerful our engagements are with the digital space this time. Like, it was it's necessary right now. We couldn't be doing this if we didn't have a digital space to do that in. And when I think about children, I think it's the same thing as if you give them, like I said, a cup and say, this is for water, and you use this for water only, or you use it for drinking. I feel like digital platforms are kind of the same way. We often hand them to them and say, you got to do this with it. This is how it works. We are the one who created it. I'm going to put this off. Clara, who is on here somewhere, did some really beautiful work that she could probably speak to at some point, with letting children create their own apps. And that is, I think that's kind of this idea that children are less than, we have to move away from, like that they don't have any input, like that we always know better for them. I think is the thing that we really have to, because it's really a deficit discourse. We don't see it as that because we wrap it up in this idea of developmentally appropriate, right? But it really is more of like this deficit discourse around what children can and can't do. When in actuality, if children have great ideas, if we just let them give us some of them, right? Like let them be a voice at the table. So I think that in and of itself is really important. To kind of use that a digital space at large, right?
Thanks for that, Jay. Jane also has a question, which I think follows very neatly. It's almost like I've had these specially prepared. Jane, did you want to come in and ask your questions around the constructions of play? Because I think that follows really nicely on from what Jay was just talking about. Jane?
Sure. Sorry, I just had a technical difficulty. Yes, I was just, so you looked at a range of discourses and around children play in the pandemic. And I was just wondering, we're speaking about play in digital spaces. Did you see any kind of shifts over the period of time in terms of how people were constructing play in digital spaces? Because often it's sort of like it's constructed as a second class form of play. It's not really play because it's digital play. And yeah, I just wondered if you had come across any sort of interesting shifts in that sort of way.
I mostly, the things I would find were children playing with other materials, right? Like that's and really just like what I would call like the artifacts that are left over, where parents are taking photos of like things that happened along the way. And a lot of the digital space was wrapped up in this idea of like, we're going to meet with our class now, or we're going to do a reading with, or there certainly were moments of like digital engagements with things like Sesame Street and songs or play, what would be called, like, I know my niece had quite a few digital play dates, right, where she would play with other people across a digital screen. But it's interesting because one of the discourses that surrounded that was this idea that everybody's got fatigue, digital fatigue, and children, including children, because they're having to do things for schooling online, and nobody wants to do that anymore. But I mean, in actuality, I was already using the computer quite a lot. So it's a very, I don't know that, like you said, it's very interesting for you to bring that up, because it may be that families didn't see that as a form of play or a form of something interesting, because maybe they play on an iPad or whatever at any point in time, right? So before the pandemic. So it is an interesting thing to think about, and maybe something to even like hashtag and look up and see how that, see what you find.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah,
thank you.
And Clara, just a nice place for to finish our question section, I think, around the questions that adults ask of children and how that might actually either enable or constrain things. Did you have something you wanted to have a quick chat with Jaye around?
Jaye, firstly, thank you for sharing your wonderings. I really liked how you positioned play as engaging in world making, and I think that the definitions of play really sometimes constricts what is going to be presented to everybody, especially when it's presented by adults as an interpretation of children's play. And as you said, there's probably so much more that were discarded and not considered play by adults. So my question really was related to that. So I'm always wondering about the questions that adults pose to children, the impositions we place on children as they create their identities. But how do we allow children to produce their own constructions of the world in digital spaces? Because I can't really see how we are really giving children opportunities to do that.
I would agree with you. This is one of the things, like, right when I was getting to like, okay, how do I make sense of all of this for practice? And I was like, I mean, I'm not asking any children. Like, I'm in this, like, everything that was put online, everything that's getting produced out there for me to see is all created by adults. And certainly, I mean, like that, and which is one of the reasons why I led to the work that I am working towards doing now, is because I really want to know the stories from the children's perspective of how they're experiencing it. Or from young people in general. And I know there are a few places online that have started thinking about that. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing, right? Because I know some of these social platforms have said that they were going to do a child or a young person friendly space. And then there was pushback about that. And then, so it's like one of those things where they're like, I don't think that they've been really given like you said, the opportunity to construct their own digital space, other than maybe when you were working with them, because your work does do that. But it is all adult world. It's a very interesting assumptional space, I think, right?
Interesting, and what a nice segue into also recognizing that today is World Teachers Day. So or World Educators Day. I think some of us are shifting that term, which is pretty spectacular and amazing to actually think about, the responsibility and the privilege that comes with being able to be named as a teacher on World Teachers Day. Jaye, thank you so much. I've made so many notes, and you've really sparked, a lot of things that I've been thinking about and brought them together and started them circling again. So I really appreciate it. I'm sure, as I said, I'm representing everybody else. I'm going to hand back to Lisa just to finish off the session. We keep ourselves we have a lot of pride in the fact that we've finished exactly on time each time we've had one of these sessions. And I work very hard for that. So I'll hand back quickly for Lisa and just say thank you very much again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jay. You always give us so much to think about. Sorry, I'm trying to share the next sessions, but I'm having a bit of a glitch with PowerPoint today. So we'll make sure that everybody who's registered for this session knows about the upcoming sessions. Jay, you're such a good friend to us at UOW and to the Centre of Excellence itself. So thank you for your time. It's always great to see you. And thanks everyone for joining us.